Um, Out of respect for everyone's time, we will get going. My name is Lisa Koppelman. I'm a program and the team director at the MRCT Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here today. First, a few housekeeping details. We are recording this webinar, and you just heard that message. So we will be posting this in a few days' time on the MRCT Center website. And with that, I'm going to ask my colleague to start the slide deck so I can give you all a proper welcome. Thank you. So again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're dialing in from. My name is Lisa Koppelman, and I work at the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center. I'm delighted to welcome you to part one of the two-part webinar entitled Facilitating Pediatric Medicines Development, Models of Global Cooperation. This is the fourth in a five-part webinar series entitled Advancing International Pediatric Clinical Research. The series is supported in part by an FDA Scientific Conference grant program. So next slide, please. First, a few housekeeping details. As I noted already, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted in a few days' time. I have no personal financial conflicts of interest to disclose. Please note, importantly, that the opinions expressed today by all the speakers, all the presenters, belong to those of the individual and not the agencies or organizations or entities that they are connected with. I just wanted to point out one thing. This is a Zoom webinar platform. So you'll note at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A or a question and answer function. We do ask that you use that when you'd like to pose questions later on in the panel discussion portion of this webinar. As a participant, an attendee, you will not have audio or visual access. So that is your means to communicate with us. Next slide, please. So before we get going, I'd like to just briefly give you an overview of the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center, the MRCT Center, the pediatrics-focused project that we've been working on these past few years, and just a little bit more about this webinar series. We at the MRCT Center are a small research and policy center. We sit between the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard University in Boston, Massachusetts, and we act as a neutral convener of multi-stakeholder groups. Our vision is really to improve the integrity, the safety, and the rigor of global clinical trials. And we do that by sticking close to our mission, which is we engage a diverse stakeholder group who define emerging issues related to the conduct of global clinical trials. And then we work to create and implement solutions that are ethical, actionable, and practical. Next slide, please. Working in this fashion, a number of years ago, we conducted a series of scoping discussions, and none of this is new to you. I fully realize I'm preaching to the choir, but the discussions really focused on the fact that it remains critical, despite the great work that's being done by so many individuals and entities across the globe, it remains critical to further figure out how to promote global clinical research in children. So why is this important? I think we can all agree that children deserve access to safe and effective medicines. And the way we do this is by including them with respect, with ethical integrity, and with their best interests at heart in clinical trials. A number of issues make it more difficult to run trials for pediatrics. There are persistent ethical issues. The regulations differ country to country or may be non-existent. There are multiple challenges in initiating and conducting trials. And something that we heard over and over in the course of our discussions with this project group that I mentioned was that the pediatric patient voice and the voice of family members and those who care for the children is not routinely solicited or included in the research life cycle. I guess at the end of the day, we feel that children continue to not routinely be offered a seat at the table. So with that as a backdrop, next slide, please. We set about convening a project group. We gathered a leadership team with a diverse representation from academia, from regulators, from industry, from participant advocates, and we convened a large, very large multi-stakeholder group with great geographic diversity who met monthly for 90 minutes for more than a year and discussed issues In broad terms, we were looking to identify and propose solutions for some of the ethical, regulatory, and operational challenges that we mentioned previously. We've done a good deal of work. The active part of the work group has ceased, and we are working very hard behind the scenes on an array of deliverables that include a landscape of targeted issues related to pediatric research governance. We look to identify issues to improve overall pediatric research globally. We've looked at issues related to benefit risk, different barriers that can impede the efficiency of transnational research with children. And we've looked to identify meaningful ways where we can engage with pediatric patients, families, and those who care for them. Next slide, please. So with that as a backdrop, we were awarded this FDA funding that I previously mentioned, and we were tasked with hosting a 5-part webinar series, again, titled Advancing International Pediatric Clinical Research. This is an offshoot of the Pediatrics Project, and thus far we have hosted 3 webinars. The first was conducted in October of 2021, and it had everything to do with what we learned from COVID-19 as it related to the pediatric population. We talked about optimal timing for vaccine trials. We talked about what does it really take to stand up trials, what infrastructure is needed. This was followed on by a webinar in February of this year that had everything to do with hearing from young people in clinical research. This webinar was structured around young people's recorded thoughts on what adults should know when they're conducting research with children. And we heard a lot of interesting perspectives and points of view and that we could all really learn from. This past June, we followed up with our 3rd webinar, which focused on assent and consent in the field, with a particular eye to the role of culture, the context in which the research takes place, and overall respect. Today, again, I'm delighted to welcome you to part 1 of this 2-part webinar that will be looking at models of global cooperation. And looking ahead, we'll be pleased to present our 5th and final webinar sometime in the winter of 2023, details to follow, that will be an overall launch of the MRCT Center Pediatrics Project. Once we get into the webinar, we're not going to spend a lot of time with individual introductions. So I would direct you to a bio book that we put together that gives you an idea of how amazing all the individuals who are participating as presenters and panelists today are. And my colleague has dropped that into the chat. Before we dive in to the webinar, next slide, please. I'm really thrilled to share with you what is actually an international world premiere of a video short. This was put together by our colleagues from the International Children's Advisory Network. They interviewed children from all over the globe and put together with us, for us, 3 short videos. We've premiered the other 2 at prior webinars, and this one we'll be sharing with you today is the 3rd in the 3-part series called Prioritizing Young People's Voices in Clinical Research. I always like to start these webinars with a video short because I think that sometimes we can get lost in theoretical musings and ethical ponderings. And really, at the end of the day, I think what unites us all is the thought that kids are at the bottom of all this, and kids deserve access to medicines and therapeutics. And this is why we're all engaged in the work. So with that, I'd ask you to turn your attention to this short video. Thank you.
So my name is Rhiannon Perry. I'm 18 and I live in the United States.
Alani Junior, 19 years. I'm from Uganda.
My name is Kaylee. I'm 16 years old and I live in the United States of America.
Hi everyone, I'm Valeria, I'm 17. I'm from Ossoni, as well known the white city in Puglia, so I'm from Italy.
What is one thing you want to tell researchers about clinical trials or research in young people?
That it's better to be honest with us so we understand what are the real benefits and doubts of what's going to happen.
It's alright to speak and to decide, because if there is a decision to make, there are the doctor that is the specialist of this disease, then the parents of the patients and the patients, and then together they have discussions about these decisions, and then they can decide what is better for the patients.
Researchers should know that young people are delicate and therefore they have to be handled with extra care. Clinical trials may offer a new care option to a kid battling a disease that has no approved therapies.
So one thing that I would really wish that researchers understood is that it is a new experience for everybody, not just you, but also for us. And so as we learn with each other, we also have to understand that not everything is innate knowledge. It's more so about ensuring that we have an open line of communication with each other.
What do you think motivates young people to get involved?
When children are more sicker, it gives them a freedom of hope to know that I'm so much closer to where I was. I'm almost there. I can be just like every other kid. I'm almost there.
The young people are motivated by, I say about me, by my group, my kids group, and also the ICA group.
Young people are motivated by their future goals to become scientists, physiologists, and doctors, among others.
So I think what entices patients a lot is understanding that there is a possibility that they'll get away with being a normal kid. And that's really what everybody wants, at our age, and even younger, just wanting to be able to play outside without having to worry, Going through all of that pain, maybe enduring 2 years more of that is worth being able to experience a life without having to carry an inhaler with you or having to take a certain medicine at a certain time.
What is important for the decision makers to know?
It's okay to say that this might not work and it might will work, because for me, mine didn't work, but that's perfectly fine. The information that I gave was good enough and able to help them understand that not everybody's the same and not everything's gonna work for everybody. So I think it's better if you just be honest and more relatable to the kid. It helps them understand and makes it okay for them to know that it's okay that it doesn't work at all.
It is important to know, first of all, if it can be solved, the problem that the person have, and also they have to know the risk and the benefit of each decision they make, because how Hamlet of Shakespeare teaches us that when we make a decision, we had to know the consequences and respect them.
Decision makers should know that the drugs being tried may be harmful to their lives.
I think sometimes, again, the risk outweigh the benefits, and sometimes the benefits outweigh the risk. I met someone along the way, and it was said that when she was having a cut or anything, that she had to be very, very cautious of how long it was bleeding and where it was bleeding at and how it was going. And sometimes as a kid, all you want to do is just jump off the tree. All you want to do is just, try and fail. And I think the hard part about it is that when you're in our position, you can't really have that free will to do so. So I think what really entices them is being able to have that knowledge that after 2 years of struggling, just putting in all of that hard work and dedication through it alongside these researchers and doctors who are here for you, that there's a possibility that you'll be able to just jump in the pool and go with it.
With this great reminder that we're here for the children, and that's why we do this work. Next slide, please. I'm really, really delighted to quickly run through the agenda for today. We will be having 4 brief presentations. The first, presented by Dr. Donna Snyder from the US FDA. She'll be talking about the pediatric regulatory cluster. That will be followed by Dr. Tahira Khan from AbbVie, who will be discussing parallel scientific advice. That will be followed by Dr. Gilles Vassal, who will be talking about the Accelerate Multi-Stakeholder Discussion Forum model. And finally, we have a pre-recorded presentation from Dr. Marie Valentin from the World Health Organization, who will be talking about the Reliance model. After those 4 brief presentations, we will take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back for the moderated panel, which will be the remainder of this webinar. The panel will focus on strengths and opportunities, excuse me, of existing models of global cooperation, and will be moderated by Dr. Dominic Karras, who is one of the leadership team members with the Pediatrics Project from the EMA. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Donna Cooper. Thanks so much to her and everyone else for being here.
Good morning, everybody. If we can go to the first slide. Great to be here. And my topic today is global collaboration in the pediatric cluster. Next slide. I don't have anything to disclose. Next slide. So these are the objectives of my talk today. I'm going to provide an overview of the US and EU regulatory requirements. They apply to global drug development in pediatrics, including some similarities and differences. I'll describe the history of the pediatric cluster, review the processes and procedures of the cluster, and provide an overview of our output since inception, and of course, summarize at the end. Next slide, please. So this is a busy slide, but I thought it was nice to include this here. This includes the historical milestones and legislation in pediatrics, and I'm not going to review it all, but you can see that there's a long history here, starting with some of the influences of some of the atrocities that occurred in children that led to some of our laws to support safety and effectiveness at FDA in the 1990s, was when we started including, when we added the requirement to include pediatric labeling and talked about extrapolation. And then in the early 2000s, we developed the laws that we use today that influence the work that we do in the cluster. Next slide, please. So this slide here drills down a little bit more to what we have in terms of our legislation that affects what we're doing now. As you can see here, FDA has a little bit more history here. We had some initial attempts in the 1990s to establish both laws to support both exclusivity, which is a law which allows us to offer some incentives to sponsors to encourage them to conduct studies, and then also the pediatric rule was introduced in 1998 to require sponsors to conduct studies. The pediatric rule was actually enjoined by the court in 2002, wasn't allowed to go forward because the DC court thought that we had actually gone beyond our authority, but we were able to introduce new legislation in the 2000s to actually deal with that situation. So in 2002, the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act was introduced. This is the law that introduces the concept of the written request, where a sponsor can request that, or the FDA can request that individuals conduct studies under a written request, and what's in the written request needs to be fulfilled in order for the company to obtain that exclusivity. In 2003, the Pediatric Research and Equity Act replaced the pediatric rule, and this is the law that we rely on today that requires sponsors to conduct studies in indications that they're developing for adults, unless we happen to waive that requirement because we don't think the studies should be done or that the particular indications are pertinent in children. In 2007, the Pediatric Review Committee was established through one of the reauthorizations of the PDUFA funding. In
I think she's on mute.
Don, I think we've lost your audio.
Thanks for your patience while Donna looks like she's reconnecting.
Sorry about that. It seems that I lost my connectivity there. I don't know when I was cut off, but essentially I was describing the laws that we have in the US that require us to conduct studies in children, or require sponsors to conduct studies in children, as well as the written request process, which gives the sponsor the opportunity to conduct studies for extra exclusivity added to their product. And then at the bottom of this slide, you'll find the EU regulations, which were introduced in 2006. And then in 2007, the Pediatric Committee, or the PDCO, was established. Both the PERC and the PDCO review pediatric plans to discuss what studies should be conducted in children that have been submitted by sponsors. So we can go to the next slide, please. So this slide outlines the regulatory processes for new drug development in the US and the EU, and you'll see that there's a little bit of a difference here. And I'm noting now that the animations that I added to these slides is appearing. I thought the slides might show up with all of the animation already there. So go ahead and go to the next animation, please. So, in the EU, the pediatric investigational plan is actually agreed upon in phase 1, whereas in the US, please go ahead and hit the button again. The initial IPSP is established. There's a little bit of difference in timing here. And then, of course, a written request can be also issued between phase 2 and phase 3. In the US, the EMA doesn't have that particular process. And then modifications to the IPSP written request can be proposed by FDA or by the sponsor. However, in the EU, modifications to the PIP can only be proposed by a sponsor. And then finally, one more point on this slide, written requests can also be issued after a product has been approved in adults. We also have a process review of pediatric safety, and the post-marketing requirements may be issued by the FDA after the approval of a product. The next slide, please. So this slide just talks about what our goals are with the pediatric cluster, and this was outlined in the paper that's noted at the bottom of the slide, that FDA and EMA are committed to ongoing harmonization of scientific issues and convergence of approaches through the work of the pediatric cluster, with a view towards a more global approach to the effective and efficient development of medicines for pediatric patients. Next slide, please. This slide includes the history of the pediatric cluster. So both the US and EU agreed upon a memorandum of understanding in 2003 in order to create a cluster process. That allows us to share confidential commercial information. However, we generally don't share trade secrets. In 2004, the first formal FDA EMA cluster met. That was for hematology oncology medicines. But it wasn't until 2007 that the pediatric cluster met. And if you can hit the button one more time, that animation will pop up on the slide. And the interesting thing about this is it coincided with the issuance of the legislation, both in the EU and the creation of the Pediatric Review Committee in the US and the PDCO in the EU. So this allowed us to be able to discuss those pediatric plans at the cluster, and it was a nice mix and good timing for all of this to occur. The next slide, please. So what are the objectives of the pediatric cluster? To facilitate regular exchange of information related to scientific and ethical issues on pediatric product development submitted according to the legislations of both areas, to avoid exposing children to unnecessary or duplicative trials, to aim at global pediatric development in line with the pediatric legislation and regulations in both areas, to understand the scientific rationale when differences in opinion exist, to discuss post-marketing pediatric requirements and issues, including risk management and plans for long-term safety monitoring, discuss general topics of regulatory and scientific interest to all the participating agencies, and inform the participants of any planned meetings that might be of interest to both or all groups to attend the cluster. Next slide, please. So in addition to FDA and EMA, we have a number of other agencies that are part of the pediatric cluster. FDA and EMA started working together in 2007. Japan's Pharmaceuticals and Medicine Device Agency, or PMDA, joined as observers in 2009. Health Canada joined as observers in 2010. Both PMDA and Health Canada became active participants in 2012. Australia's Therapeutic Goods Administration, or TGA, joined as observers in 2014 and became active participants in 2016. Next slide, please. So since the inception of the cluster, there have been 194 TCONs, 663 product discussions, and 198 general topics that have been discussed. The most frequently discussed product issues through 2021, and I would venture to say also in 2022, have been the scope of pediatric development, safety, types of clinical studies, study design, and study population. And overall, we have what we consider to be a high rate of convergence, historically greater than 70%. And this convergence is only related to products that have been discussed at the cluster, but these are areas where we find that we have agreed upon a path forward, or where we're aligned in terms of the issues that have been discussed at the cluster at that particular time. Next slide, please. This slide includes a number of pediatric cluster teleconferences from 2007 through 2021. You'll see there's a red line across the middle that really indicates that each year we have 10 scheduled teleconferences. We don't have one in August or December, but there have been occasions where we needed to have additional teleconferences. Those are the ad hoc TCONs, and those are above the red line. And that varies from year to year. Next slide. So areas of discordance have been in the areas of clinical trial endpoints, interpretation of significance of non-clinical data, ability to extrapolate in the use of bridging biomarkers, potential need for juvenile toxicology studies, and differences in clinical standard of care. Next slide, please. So how are topics added to the agenda? At the FDA, topics are often suggested at the PERC meetings, but anyone from the participating agencies can request a topic. Sponsors can request their product be discussed at the pediatric cluster. However, it's up to the agencies to decide if it's appropriate for that topic to come to the cluster. There may be examples, for example, I know we're talking about parallel scientific advice, where that might be a more appropriate path for a sponsor to pursue. And for FDA, that request should be sent to the relevant review division and not to OPT. The topics can be general or for a specific product. Next slide, please. And this just talks about who has proposed topics for this pediatric cluster between 2018 and 2021. As you can see, the vast majority have come from FDA or EMA, although we have had some requests from sponsors and an occasional request from Health Canada. Next slide, please. This discusses the therapeutic areas from 2021. You can see the vast majority are in the area of oncology, antivirals, and neurology. Next slide. So this is how we handle external communications. There are a couple of different ways that we may interact with sponsors or with individuals outside the agencies. And I'll talk more about the common commentary on the next slide, but common commentary started in 2012, and this is a way to provide informal comments on the development program to a sponsor. These are not binding or considered to be formal regulatory advice. We do issue action items from the pediatric cluster, and we share these with sponsors if it's appropriate. These are very high-level comments to inform sponsors that their product was discussed and the agreed action. The process for conveying these action items to the sponsor are the following. If the procedure is still going on at EMA will incorporate the action into the summary report to inform the sponsor. If the PIP is already agreed on or is in clock stop, OPT will inform the sponsor. There have been other ways that we've communicated. There's been joint guidance which was issued for Gaucher's disease. There have been a number of workshops that have been conducted. The one that I listed here is the EMA FDA Health Canada joint workshop discussing pulmonary arterial hypertension. Next slide, please. So this slide talks about the common commentary process, and a common commentary document is generally a very short document, 1 or 2 pages long. And the purpose of a common commentary is to provide, as I've already mentioned, these informal, non-binding comments to sponsors. And we will do these when there's a simultaneous pediatric development plan that's been submitted to both EMA and FDA. The pediatric development plans are currently under review, and the product is discussed at the pediatric cluster. Product-specific common commentaries may be considered when there's a life-threatening disease or a serious disease for which there are few or no therapeutic options, and we feel like it's important to move forward a global program rather urgently. Other situations may be if it's non-life-threatening, but there's a major issue such as trial design, endpoint, or safety or dosing issues that need to be agreed upon. General topic common commentaries may be considered when the agencies determine that sharing information on the approach to studying a disease or condition will be helpful to sponsors. And in order to develop these documents, EMA and FDA discuss when they've discussed a product if a common commentary might be appropriate. The document is created and cleared by both agencies before being sent to the sponsor, but some general common commentaries have been posted on the respective agencies' websites. Next slide, please. This slide includes the therapeutic areas for which common commentaries have been issued since 2012. Oncology has the largest proportion of common commentaries, followed by GI, antivirals, and genetic disorders. Next slide, please. And these are the 3 public common commentaries that are posted on the OPT website. One on prevention and treatment of COVID-19, the second one on common issues requested for discussion by respective agencies concerning pediatric oncology development plans, and the Gaucher disease common commentary that led to also the development of a guidance. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight this COVID-19 common commentary, and this is an excerpt taken from this common commentary, which is a 2-page document. And I just wanted to show how the rationale for this particular common commentary was to show sponsors how they might be able to take the requirements for the PIP and the IPSP and to ensure that those requirements are included in both documents to create a more global program. And this was necessary during COVID-19 because we found that these IPSPs and PIPs were being submitted to both agencies and needed relatively rapid action, and we wanted to make sure that all the information was there. Next slide, please. This slide just highlights the members of the international team in the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics. I lead both the ethics and international team, but the lion's share of work is done by the other 3 individuals on this slide. Sarah Zahidi is medical officer in OPT who moderates the meetings and provides scientific advice for the background documents. G.T. Wharton took over project management of the pediatric cluster in May of this year and handles internal and external communications. And Suzanne Malley is our historical knowledge person within OPT. She's been with the cluster work since its inception in 2007, but now has moved on to help on the ethics side as well as acting as liaison for our workshop with Japan. Next slide, please. So in summary, the goal of the pediatric cluster is to promote a global approach to pediatric development plans with harmonization of scientific issues and convergence of approaches when possible. FDA and EMA may issue a common commentary or provide action items from pediatric cluster discussions to sponsors when appropriate. Sponsors can request to have their products discussed at the pediatric cluster and can request a common commentary. For FDA, we ask that you contact the appropriate review division. And the COVID-19 common commentary illustrates how an IPSP and PIP submission may be aligned to meet the regulatory requirements of both the FDA and EMA. Next slide. And thank you very much for your attention.
A big thank you to Dr. Donna Snyder from the US FDA. This was a fantastic presentation that really walked through the intricacies of the pediatric regulatory cluster. So thank you so much. And I'd like to now turn it over to Dr. Tahira Khan from AbbVie, who will be talking about parallel scientific advice. Thank you.
Hello. For some reason, I cannot. Yeah, okay. Thanks. The topic that I'll be covering is parallel scientific advice. Next slide, please. This is my disclaimer slide. Next slide, please. The outline of my talk today is I'll be covering some background defining what parallel scientific advice is, then going through the procedure of parallel scientific advice and what outcome could be expected by sponsors at the end of this procedure. Then some of the benefits of parallel scientific advice, and I will at the end also talk about a hypothetical case study, which is actually a combination of two different procedures. So it's an interesting case study. Next slide, please. So parallel scientific advice is another program for global cooperation. And this was initiated by EMA and FDA in 2005 and then afterwards extended indefinitely. The objective of parallel scientific advice is to enable EMA and FDA assessors and sponsors to come to the table and exchange their views on scientific issues during the development phase of new medicinal products. The best candidates for PSA include important medicines, for example, for unmet medical needs, for which guidelines do not exist or for which guidelines differ significantly, products with unique or significant issues that could impede further development, for example, products with issues concerning clinical safety, animal toxicology, or unique manufacturing concerns. Some of the previous PSAs have involved unmet medical needs, pediatric population, rare diseases, anti-infectives, etc. Next slide, please. So the procedure in summary is voluntary and is usually initiated at the sponsor's request. However, it may also be initiated by either agency in cooperation with the sponsor. The parallel scientific advice should focus primarily on specific questions or issues involving the development of the product for further scientific input from both FDA and EMA to better inform, for example, the design of a study or some issues that has risen during the development of the product. It addresses one set of questions by the sponsor that are included in a briefing package. It is not a series of consultations. These meetings are conducted under the provision of the confidentiality arrangement between the FDA and EMA and with the sponsor's authorization. If the PSA request is denied by one or both agencies, independent scientific advice may also be sought by sponsor, or experts from one agency may be invited by the other for discussions. Next slide, please. So the process of parallel scientific advice initiates with an informal request. For example, if the sponsor wants to initiate the process, this request is sent to both the FDA and EMA. And if they agree, then this is followed by a formal letter of intent to both agencies. This is a single letter that goes along with a briefing package that includes a list of questions. Some of the questions may be specific to a certain agency, and that is clarified in the briefing book. There is a validation process through which the briefing, the contents of the briefing package goes through. This is to ensure that, that everything that is needed to move ahead with the review process is included in the briefing package. The sponsor may also ask for a pre-EMA meeting, which can be granted. After the briefing package is validated, the contents go through a review process at both the FDA and EMA. The two agencies usually will meet before going into a trilateral meeting with the sponsor. And the trilateral meeting, before that happens, the two agencies will send their informal feedback to the sponsor, which is then integrated by the sponsor into a slide presentation. And this slide presentation is then used for the trilateral meeting, which runs to about 90 minutes and happens at day 60 after the book is validated. Once the trilateral meeting occurs, FDA and EMA could meet again and then send their scientific advice to the sponsor. Next slide, please. So in terms of the outcome, from a sponsor's perspective, sometimes they are looking for totally convergent feedback from the two agencies, which may not always happen because they're two independent entities. So the sponsors will receive independent advice from FDA and EMA on the questions posed during the PSA. Both FDA and EMA will aim to provide responses that are convergent. And from the examples that we've seen, there are usually quite high convergence. However, as I mentioned, sponsors may not receive the same recommendations from the two agencies regarding certain issues. Next slide, please. There are several benefits of parallel scientific advice. In my mind, the first one is that it actually avoids duplicative work, and the time that it takes to go through the parallel scientific advice and prepare for it is almost the same as if we were to go through two separate meetings. The benefit is concurrent FDA and EMA scientific advice, where the three stakeholders come to the same table, and it's a single meeting mechanism. Through the conversation, the sponsor and also the health authorities can get a clearer and deeper understanding of regulatory and scientific perspectives on the development program, and if divergent, the reasons for divergence. It provides FDA and EMA with an opportunity to identify sponsors' concerns in implementing regulatory advice. It optimizes global medicinal development and avoids unnecessary duplication of work. In my mind, it is also a good forum to identify hurdles in global development of new medicines, particularly in new areas or unmet disease settings, to further inform policy development and potential regulatory changes that could be considered. Next slide, please. In the end, I have a hypothetical case study where a sponsor could utilize two separate meeting procedures for a single trilateral meeting. For example, if a sponsor wanted to qualify a novel study design and associated regulatory processes for pediatric medicinal development with joint input from EMA and FDA, it could on the surface be a problem because the EMA and FDA do not have a qualification procedure, a joint qualification procedure for novel study design. There are other joint procedures such as for biomarkers and clinical outcome assessments. So the way to come around this problem would be to proceed with the EMA qualification procedure and then utilize the PSA procedure to invite FDA to discuss the issues raised with EMA. The same briefing package can be submitted to both the agencies, resulting in joint FDA and EMA discussions followed by a trilateral meeting with the sponsor. So the outcome is a better understanding of the scientific and regulatory issues related to proposed study design, and it could be possible that the feasibility of implementing a new study design globally could come to the surface during this meeting so that the sponsor has a better understanding in the long term. Next slide, please. So these are some references that can be used by our audience to dig deeper into some of the issues. That's all from me. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Dr. Khan, for that really important laying out of all the processes and procedures that go along with parallel scientific advice. At this point, we will turn it over to Dr. Vassal for his presentation on the Accelerate model. Thank you. Dr. Vassal, you're on mute. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I was so
No?
anxious to start that I forgot to switch on my camera. So
no problem.
So the goal is to discuss the Accelerate Strategy forums. These are my disclosures. And I was starting to share with you the situation of childhood cancer in the world. More than 400,000 new cases worldwide annually. And the low and the middle income countries, the cure rate is between 15 and 45%. The clear goal and challenge to give access to all these children to standard effective treatments. In the high-income country, the probability of cure of disease-free survival at 5 years is 80%, with major differences across malignancies, from 95% for kidney cancer down to 10% for brain tumors. And 2/3 of these cured children will experience long-term toxicity when they are childhood cancer survivors. So the message is that it is still, despite major progress over the last 40 years, the leading cause of deaths from disease beyond the age of 1 year, with 6,000 deaths in Europe and approximately the same in the US. So the clear goal is cure more patients, cure them better, and tackle inequalities, because there are major inequalities, including across Europe. And this is why the WHO Global Childhood Cancer Initiative has an ambitious goal at the worldwide level to save 1 million lives from cancer by 2030. We are very lucky that in the US and Europe, we do have a regulatory environment to really favor better medicine for children. And this is the regulation that you all know and that was beautifully summarized by Donna Snyder. This is based on obligations, incentives, and rewards for sponsors developing medicines. But so far, neither regulation has been really delivering well for childhood cancer. And I want to take one example, the example of the ALK inhibition story. In 1994, the anaplastic lymphoma kinase gene was discovered, altered in lung cancer in adults, and altered in several pediatric malignancies, such as the anaplastic lymphoma, kinase large cell lymphoma in children and adolescents. In 2011 and 2012, the first in-class ALK inhibitor, crizotinib, was approved for the treatment of ALK-positive lung cancer in the US and in Europe. But under both regulations, the drug was waived for pediatric development because lung cancer does not exist in children. Because there was a very strong rationale, biological rationale to explore this medicine in pediatric malignancies, there has been several pediatric development plans run by an academic cooperative group with more than 200 patients treated, evaluated, and showing the activity of the drug. And in January 2021, the drug was approved by the FDA for the treatment of anaplastic large cell lymphoma in children. And in September 22, in Europe, not only for ILCL, but also for inflammatory myofibroblastic tumor, which means that there have been 10 years between the first approval in adults and the first approval in children for a safe and effective medicine in this disease. So this is why we say we need to accelerate and address these issues. And this is on this background that the Accelerate multi-stakeholder organization was created in 2015 after 4 years of preparation. And their goal is to improve and accelerate new drug development for children and adolescents with cancer, with a very simple concept, a patient-centric organization to try to solve problems. It's truly international. It's truly multi-stakeholder, as you can see in the steering committee, with 4 colleges, academia, industry, patients advocacy, and regulators, each stakeholder having the equal voice in the organization. How do we work? Very simple, trying to solve problems and shaping the international landscape for pediatric oncology drug development. First, identify a problem, and this is the goal of our annual conference. Second, understand the issue in an open multi-stakeholder dialogue with a clear motto, no blame, no shame. This is what happened. Try to understand why and find a solution. Generate data, find solution, and then implement. The very first work done by Accelerate was on trying to solve the issue of crizotinib. And in 2016, this working group published this proposal of implementation of mechanism of action, biology-driven early drug development for children with cancer. This was 1 year before the Race for Children Act was launched, approved in the US. As you can see, this is a paper authored by academia, advocacy, industry, and regulatory bodies. The objective was very clear. First, set up aggregated database of pediatric biological tumor targets to know whether or not a target is relevant for pediatric malignancies, through all the work done by the academic institution, researchers, and so on. Set up the capability to have good preclinical data on relevant models to help defining whether or not a drug is relevant for children. And this is what is up and running at the moment with ITCCP4 in Europe and the Pivot project in the US. Set up Pediatric Strategy Forum to facilitate prioritization. Assure that all patients in the relapse setting will have a molecular profiling of their tumors to try to find out what is the alteration in their tumor and try to match that with an appropriate targeted compound. And finally, suppress the Article 11B of the European regulation, which says that a drug should not be developed in children if the disease in adults is not occurring in children. So we created the Pediatric Strategy Forum on this background. Very simple. The goal is to share with all stakeholders, to evaluate science, current knowledge, and to inform by this way further pediatric development strategy and then subsequent decisions. So it is a multi-stakeholder meeting in an open dialogue in pre-competitive setting that will discuss either a malignancy or a class of compounds. And really the goal is to facilitate prioritization when the discussion is being done between a sponsor and EMA, FDA, or joined together through the common commentary as discussed before. We started in 2017. The very first strategy forum was addressing ALK inhibition, and you understand why. We did the 10th Pediatric Strategy Forum last month at the European Medicine Agency, and we discussed DNA damaging agents. In 2020, we decided to alternate in Europe and in US. But then the COVID crisis came up, and we need to do the next 4 meetings by Zoom. And clearly, we will do again the alternates, and we plan to be in Boston next year for a strategy forum on PI3K, AKT, mTOR inhibition. So overall, all these forums have been discussing more than 200 assets with 1,000 participants from an industry, from academia, patient advocates and regulators, from the EMA and from the FDA, because these forums are being set up in collaboration with the EMA and participation by the FDA. All these forums are published, and this is clearly the evidence from the forum about science, needs, and proposal for prioritization. In 2019, the FDA, in this guidance for the pediatric studies of molecular targeted oncology drugs in preparation of the implementation of the REST Act, recommended participation to the Accelerate Pediatric Strategy Forum. In 2020, the pediatric EMA team and the PDCO, the Pediatric Committee, published this paper addressing the question of how this forum can really help prioritization and asking for experimenting this concept outside of oncology. Just to show you how it works, in 2017, we had the second forum on mature B-cell malignancies in children. 80 participants from the 4 stakeholders discussing more than 20 assets. And the conclusion was, in this disease where the probability of survival is 95% with an intensive chemotherapy, adding with some immunotherapy by rituximab, the clear objective is to develop innovative treatments for the patients remaining incurable because all patients relapsing die. Try to reduce the high acute toxicity of this treatment, high intensive chemotherapy frontline. The conclusion of the stakeholder meeting was A, successful de-escalation at low risk in frontline therapy can only be undertaken with an effective salvage therapy regimen, and we need to focus in the treatment of relapse, addressing the issue of very small population, needing a global strategy, but also favoring combination rather than monotherapy in the treatments. And from the academic standpoint, among all the compounds developed in adults in non-Hodgkin lymphoma, the 3 classes of compounds that were prioritized were antibody drug conjugate, CAR T cells, and T-cell engagers. From this, what happened? We created an international platform trial called GLOW-NHL to facilitate the implementation of new medicine for these very rare patients in relapse. And we conducted, with the help of EMA, an evaluation of the impact of the forum on the development of medicine in this setting. And as you can see on this table, before the forum, there have been 27 assets discussed in 10 years. And from these 27 assets, 56% of people were granted and 44% of full waivers. After the forum, there has been 36 assets in 4 years, showing how the increase in the number of medicine is in the field of oncology. And 25% only of pediatric investigation plan has been granted versus waivers. So clearly we show that the impact of the forum was facilitated prioritization and really generating medically and scientifically justified waivers rather than a waiver because the disease is not existing in children. Whoops. Oh. So we have been experiencing, as asked by the EMA and PDCO, the concept outside of oncology. And this is an ongoing project through Connect for Children, which is a European project in the public-private IMI2 initiative, trying to build, not trying, but building in Europe a pan-clinical trial network. And within this project, we are piloting the concept of strategy forum outside of oncology. The first was addressing pediatric inflammatory bowel disease in 2021, and this is now published in the Journal of Crohn's and Colitis. And the second one in 2022, we are discussing atopic dermatitis, demonstrating the feasibility and the value of this concept altogether, discuss a disease, understand the needs, understand what are the development, and prioritize, facilitate prioritization. In Accelerate, we don't do only Pediatric Strategy Forum. We're the working group working on fostering age-inclusive research, really to recommend and provide a rationale to include teenagers in adult early phase trial when medically and scientifically justified. There was a working group on fit for filing that come up with a publication in the Journal of Oncology, how to assure that when a clinical trial is run by academy in partnership with industry sponsor can meet the requirement of filing, really making this fit for filing. We have a long-term follow-up project building a proposal to collect information on the long-term survivors being treated with new treatments in order to understand on the long term what are the toxicity of these patients. And the last working group on international collaboration, what are the hurdles for international collaboration that we need, especially in the extremely rare setting? Finally, we are just launching an educational and training program because we thought we need to provide the physician, but also the advocates with understanding about regulatory science, how development of drug is being set up, really to facilitate the implementation and the advocacy, really to make the environment better for the development of new medicine for children with cancer. So what are the key success factors for accelerating the development of innovative medicine for children and adolescents with cancer? A, science-driven and patient-centered developments to address the unmet needs. B, introduce the use of real-world data and deep learning of multi-omics data. Third, multi-stakeholder collaboration and engagement in a favorable and incentivizing regulatory environment to facilitate prioritization. And I hope I convince you that the strategy forum is really something of value and can help in this setting. Fourth, equal access to innovative and essential medicine for all children in adolescent, 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, and the necessary global endeavor that needs international and academic collaboration. And finally, working together is feasible, efficient, and the only way to move forward. That is really the motto of Accelerate. So I would like to thank very much the Andrew McDonough Be Positive Foundation, which has supported Accelerate. Thank the dream team from Accelerate, which is really driving all the agenda with the steering committee. And I would just to inform you that we have the 11th conference of Accelerate next February in Brussels, and you are all welcome if you wish. You can contact us and have information more on this. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vassal, for that incredible presentation, really walking us through the intricacies of the Accelerate forum and model and how you're applying it to areas outside of oncology. I'd like to now present Dr. Marie Valentin from the World Health Organization with her pre-recorded presentation on reliance models. Thank you so much.
Good morning to you all. Many thanks to the organizer and MRCT for having invited us to be part of this important discussion on a model of global cooperation for pediatric medicine. Apologies, I cannot be joining you in real time. However, I will be joining for the question time and the discussion. So I'm looking forward to be discussing with all of you. My name is Marie Valentin, and I'm a technical officer in the team Regulatory Convergence and Networks at WHO headquarters in Geneva. So today I'll be talking of the different models of reliance and also some of WHO efforts in terms of facilitating registration and access to pediatric medicines globally. So why do we talk about reliance? If we look at the pictures, so WHO serves 194 member states. And if we look at the maturity level of the regulatory system in all these member states, as of October 2022, 70% of the countries, so 136 countries, are still at a maturity level 1 and 2. which is not the aim and the objective to have a stable and functioning maturity level of 3 for the majority of the member states. So we can see that many countries do not have still yet a stable and well-functioning regulatory system. So it is very important to, in those countries, to facilitate the access to quality medicine. And Reliance is a very efficient tool in terms of leveraging the work of other regulators in terms of assessment and inspection to avoid duplication and facilitate the evaluation and also the authorization of this product in different countries. So the work of WHO in terms of regulatory system strengthening has 2 work streams. One is to build the regulatory capacity of member states consistent with good regulatory practice. And the other one is to promote regulatory cooperation, convergence and transparency through networking, work sharing and reliance. So reliance is a very important part of this picture. So the aim here is to try to have a more efficient global oversight and to use the resources that are available more efficiently. We know that regulators across the world are have got an increasing workloads. They are facing many challenges, and they have to do their work in with limited global regulatory resources. So one could ask, are we really using the global regulatory resources as best as we can? And I think there is a margin for improvements in terms of trying to reduce the duplication. So if we see that, we can see that some of the assessment and evaluation are duplicated, maybe there is a better way to share the workload and to work with the global regulatory function. So what are the solutions? We've got lots of model of reliance in terms of work sharing, joint assessment, average pathway, strength and collaboration. So in the case of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen that the highest level of collaboration between regulators, which was very beneficial to facilitate access to COVID-19 vaccine and therapeutics. What are the principles for the implementation? We have to remember it's a voluntary participation, so for both the industry and the regulators. We have to change a bit the mindset because maybe we've been used to work in a certain way and to manage some of the regulatory work a certain manner, but we have to look at more innovative and more collaborative ways of working. We have to start small. We cannot change the whole pictures in one day. However, we've seen many pilots in different areas to look at how can we work better together, and we learn by doing. We know that harmonization and convergence are facilitators for reliance. However, they are not a prerequisite. So we cannot be in a position to say, oh, let's wait that everything is harmonized before we start work sharing or working together. Really, we should try to start as soon as we can and learn as we go along. So what are the main principles? As we said, is to reduce duplication and to see where there could be some potential synergy between the different regulators' work. We have to look at a risk-based approach. So where are the resources most needed? So for example, for regulators in the low and middle income countries, if a product has already been authorized by a stringent regulatory authority or is on the list from pre-qualification, obviously the risk is less than a product that has never been authorized and that is manufactured locally, for example, because they are the only one to oversee this product. And also to flag that we are changing the framework from stringent regulatory authorities to a WHO listed authority. So this interim list of WHO listed authorities is available on our websites, and some of the documentation in terms of the guidance and the performance evaluation have been published as well, the draft version, and some pilots are ongoing. And we are expecting the WLA framework to be published in Q1 2023. What we see is many pilots in different areas in terms of using reliance. Some of the regulators are very efficient. So for example, if we look at middle-sized regulators, for example, HSA Singapore is very efficient in terms of using the different resources. And they've got for post-authorization changes, some reliance model where they've got an average or verification route if the post-authorization changes has already been authorized by 1 or 2 reference NRA. in terms of trying to use what has already been done. A very interesting pilot has just started as well under the umbrella of the ICMRA, the International Coalition for Medicine Regulators Authority, where they are looking at CMC and quality changes. And instead of having 7 or 8 independent stringent regulatory authority approval, for them to have a more collaborative and work-sharing approach, so to look at the changes together. So it's beneficial for both sides, from the industry and from the regulators, in terms of putting the expertise together, and also to have a joint review and to decrease the workload. So this is a very interesting pilot, and we hope that in the future it will bring more convergence and harmonization in terms of managing post-authorization changes, because we know that post-authorization changes is a big workload for both sides, the industry and the regulators. So we see many pilots, and some of them are even driven by the industry in terms of using Reliance. So this slide is just to highlight that Reliance can be used for any regulatory function. We conducted a survey in 2019 under the umbrella of the IPRP, the International Pharmaceutical Regulator Program, where we saw that between regulators, Reliance was used a lot for initial authorization and for inspection, but we know that it can be used and it's promoted for any regulatory function. So even in terms of clinical trial application, vigilance, post-authorization, batch release, etc. And this is just to illustrate. So in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the whole responses really was using Reliance, and a natural chain of reliance was put into place from the use. So for the WHO emergency use listing, they wouldn't repeat the assessment if the assessment of a vaccine, for example, was already done by an area of reference. So, for example, the first one, the Pfizer vaccine, was listed on the EUL only 10 days after the EMA assessment, because there was a strong collaboration, and with the open initiative, WHO could participate in some of the EMA decision-making and scientific discussion. And the same from the EUL to facilitate in-country authorization. It was the EUL was a point of reference for countries. And we can see for the first rollout in February-March 2021, 101 countries gave authorization for use or import license within 15 days of the EUL, which is unprecedented, because we know that in some countries it takes months or years to register products. And this was used for all the regulatory function. I've put a link to an article that we published regarding all this Reliance use for the COVID-19 response. So this one is just to show a bit of the principle and the concept. So from historically, when the assessors were working very independently, conducting their own assessments, their own inspection, we can see that there is a certain level of duplication. Whereas where we move towards more work sharing or joint assessment, average pathway, there is leveraging of the work of others, and the workload is decreased, and also we use resources more efficiently. The last part of the slide on the right is recognition. It's a more formalized way of reliance when one regulator decides to recognize the decision of another regulator. So if we look at pediatric, we know that we are facing many challenges in terms of market incentive. The markets are sometimes considered as small and fragmented. We know that there's many delays in completing clinical studies and for delays of accessing pediatric formulation. And we know that there is some complexity and cost involved with developing pediatric formulation. So all this really make it even more essential to use Reliance and to use best the resources that we have globally. So it's very important to align the pediatric plans, to share pediatric data, to exchange on ongoing assessments. And we know that it is what is done in some of the examples that we will be discussing today for the pediatric cluster, for example, which is a strong collaboration between regulators, and a lot of the work that is currently being done in the field of oncology, as presented by some of my colleagues today. For the global pediatric regulatory landscape, we know that we have 3 countries and 1 region with mandatory requirements for pediatric plans, but we know that the pediatric needs and development are global. So as we said, it's very important to align the pediatric plans. And also, we know that all this required data requested as part of the PIP or the PSP are used for registration in other regions and countries. So it's very important to align as much as possible. For Reliance, we know that it's used a lot for pediatrics. So it's used, for example, for pediatric plans. And we've got some region and countries, for example, Swiss Medic in Switzerland would accept a foreign pediatric plan that has been agreed with the US FDA or the EMA, for example. And in the UK, the MHRA as well accept foreign pediatric plans. But also for registration, some tools like the EU M4All or Article 58 or the Swiss Marketing Authorization for Global Health Product, when we use the stringent regulatory authority assessments to register in the rest of the world, are very beneficial. And also the WHO collaborative registration procedure, where we facilitate the provision of assessment and inspection reports in countries to facilitate their decision making. For Reliance, I just want to highlight two things. We've just released an open course, so it's open access. It's a short course, it's 30 minutes video about the principle of reliance and why is it so important for the regulatory oversight of products. So I invite all participants to have a look on the open WHO. And also we've released recently with the RPRP, the International Pharmaceutical Regulators Program, a question and answer on the most frequent asked question on reliance to facilitate and promote the use of reliance. Now I'm going to move to some of the WHO efforts in terms of facilitating registration and access to pediatric medicine. The first one is the WHO Pediatric Regulatory Network that was initially created in 2010 and reactivated in 2019. This network is a network of regulators mainly, but also other stakeholders to support the availability of quality medicine for children through facilitation of communication, collaboration between the regulators. So we usually meet once a year, and we can see that the participation is increasing in terms of regulators from the 6 WHO region. And I invite you to have a look on the website. All the reports are published on the Pediatric Regulatory Network. The next one is the Global Accelerator for Pediatric Formulation, which is a WHO convened network of different stakeholders with an interest in developing pediatric medicine. And it's very important to, one of the first aspects is to do prioritization, because we know that unfortunately in pediatric, we cannot have it all, and we really have to focus. We really have to look at what are the most needed formulation and also molecules for pediatric use. So this is one of the first steps from the GAPF. And we've had some very successful example recently in terms of developing dolutegravir 10 milligrams. So to develop to incentivize generic manufacturer to develop 2 generic for dolutegravir. Thanks to a technical transfer from the originator to the generic. So the generic were authorized only a few months after the originator, and the dolutegravir 5 milligram and 10 milligram are being rolled out across the globe as we speak. So the work of GAPF is based on applying focus and collaboration throughout the life cycle of the product. So first, prioritization of products, giving a clear list of priorities in the different disease area. Streamlining the generation of clinical evidence, so looking at what is missing to support the safe and efficacious use of the product in children. Incentivizing manufacturers, so sometimes we intervene and try to find solution to incentivize and to help generic manufacturer, for example, to develop the formulation, and then to have a coordinated and accelerated product development, but also a coordinated introduction and rollouts in countries between all the different partners. The last ones I wanted to mention is the Rome Action Plan, which is a way to raise the technical work at a more political level. And it's in order to put everybody in the same room. So the governments, the industry, the donors, the regulators, to try to see how by making one step toward each other and toward the same goal, we can facilitate the development of TB and HIV product and diagnostic. And we've already have 5 successful Rome Action Plan meeting, and the next one, Rome Action Plan 6, is planned at the beginning of December. And for this one, we will be looking at some general recommendation in terms of including or recommending including breastfeeding and pregnant women in some of the trial where possible. The last one is the Global Initiative for Childhood Cancer. We know that an estimated 400,000 children develop cancer every year. Unfortunately, the survival rate is very inequitable between different countries, with 1 in 5 surviving in low and middle income countries, compared to 4 in 5 surviving in high income countries. So it's very important to try to give access to quality medicine around the globe. And one of the streamline of this global initiative for childhood cancer is to have this global platform to give access to childhood cancer medicine globally. So quickly, to summarize, we've seen that it's essential to make best use of the available regulatory resources globally. And we see that the reliance is one of the tool of the pack. The present is collaborative, but the future, I hope, will be even more collaborative. And work sharing is one of the key solutions. And we've seen that collaboration is essential for pediatric. Really, we cannot succeed if we don't all work towards the same goal, and if we don't focus the energy and the resources toward the same objective. Prioritization and focusing effort has shown that it can bring success in pediatric development. And also, I would like to acknowledge the work of all the different WHO activities in terms of global accelerator for pediatric formulation, the pediatric regulatory networks, and other initiatives. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any question in the chat or orally during the discussion. Many thanks.
Many thanks, Marie, for that fantastic presentation. And Marie has actually joined us live. So when we reconvene after approximately a 10-minute break, and we welcome Dr. Dominic Carries, who will be leading this panel discussion on strengths and opportunities of existing models of global cooperation. Marie will join the other presenters and additional panelists, as you can see on the screen, for the panel discussion. So again, many thanks to Marie, and I would propose we take a 10-minute break and reconvene at 10:35 local East Coast time, so 10 minutes, and we will then proceed with the panel discussion. Please stay logged on, just put yourself on mute, disconnect your camera if you're a panelist, and we will reconvene in just under 10 minutes. Thank you. And get ready with all those questions for the panel discussion. Thanks, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you back to the remainder of this webinar. And in just a moment, we'll get started with the panel discussion that's being moderated by Dr. Dominic Karras. Perhaps we'll just wait a few more seconds and then we'll get going. But delighted to have all the presenters from this morning here on the discussion panel. And they're joined by the individuals you see up on the slide, Dr. Ellie Berry, Dr. Gregory Riemann, and Dr. Franca Ligas. So many thanks to everyone for being here. And I will hand it off to you, Dominic. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and welcome back also from my end. I hope you have a good warm cup of coffee or tea and are ready for the next part of today's webinar, the panel discussion. And again, welcome to our additional panelists, Dr. Ali Berry, Franca Ligas, and Dr. Greg Riemann. If I could invite you all to switch on your cameras, that would be amazing. And I see Jill has already done it. That's great. Because I hope that will sort of help a sort of good conversation, discussing really now, how we can all work better together towards a sort of regulatory ecosystem built really around close collaboration, cooperation, to the ultimate goal of facilitating global pediatric development efforts, and personally hoping really to identify together with you additional opportunities, improvements we within our area of responsibility and the ecosystem as is could already maybe act upon tomorrow. The famous low-hanging fruits, if you wish, but then of course also hoping to learn from you about obstacles, as well as discussing the high-hanging fruits, or the potential bigger changes considered necessary to achieving our overarching objective. And that's something which I think will also be further picked up by tomorrow's webinar. And the respective colleagues in the panel there. But before we start with the first round of questions, and again, everyone else, please, pop your question in the Q&A if you have any. And thanks already to those who asked questions during the presentations. But before we start, I wanted to acknowledge that we might talk a lot also now as part of the panel about global developments in our discussions. But what we eventually might mean is sort of more US and Europe focused, so FDA and EMA focused reflections. And I think, all driven by the fact that as we've heard from Donna, that these are jurisdictions with regulations, strong regulations requiring pediatric development efforts. But that's of course, these are of course not the only regulatory agencies or health authorities involved as decision makers in the broader global ecosystem. There are many more stakeholders involved in addition, and ultimately much more granularity to reflect upon when discussing global cooperation supporting pediatric drug approval. Ranging from design considerations in relation to what's standard of care, clinical trial application process, ethics approvals, including the sort of day-to-day operational challenges in running intercontinental trials in the different jurisdictions. But I think the four really great presentations we've heard have now set very nicely the scene for the panel on strengths and opportunities of existing models. Different processes and the presentations describing different processes and models, all playing a distinct, I think, interconnected and sometimes synergistic role and part in supporting global regulatory cooperation with the objective to facilitate global efforts in that regard. And with that, I would directly sort of bring our additional panelists into the discussion. And as a follow-up to Donna's presentation, really nicely summarizing the cluster and its experience, also having some figures. Can I turn to you, Franca, as the EMA's coordinator of the cluster? So related to the slide in Donna's presentation on showing who proposed topics for the cluster over the years, one could recognize a slight increase in sponsors doing so, which I think is an interesting and a positive observation, I would argue. What do you think is the reason behind it? And is there something in it which we can use further to sort of strengthen the cluster as a means to foster global development efforts?
Yeah, thank you, Dominic, and everyone. also MRCT for inviting me to be part of this panel. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would like to thank all the speakers because the presentation were really clear and they highlight how it's important to collaborate. Okay, regarding to your question, yes, I started following the cluster since more or less 2 years now, and that's true. There has been an increase in request from the sponsor to have common commentary. But I would like to highlight that as far as I know, I mean, the one that we have pointed out are requests coming from applicants developing oncology products. So this is the results, I think, of the initiative that were put in place in the last years, where really the applicants were encouraged to come to submit PAP for the EMA side and PSP for the FDA side simultaneously. And at the same time, clearly the RACE Act has taken important part in this, because view of the mechanism of action that requires clearly to have pediatric clinical global developments. This has encouraged the applicant to submit pediatric development to both agencies. And I would say that other important initiatives were most likely the publication of the common commentary, the general common commentary on oncology products, where clearly the applicants were invited and encouraged to submit pediatric development simultaneously, and also to ask for common commentaries. And I think clearly really important are the pediatric strategy forum, where always the applicants are really encouraged to submit a simultaneous application. And I think that yeah, all these initiatives together make clear that this is really important, because this will allow the regulatory agencies to discuss development at the same time. So we can share our views. We can also discuss maybe different scientific views on the proposal. So this is a way clearly to strengthen the collaboration, to come back through the common commentary to the applicant and providing our views. And even if these are non-binding comments, clearly I think this is really helpful, and helpful for us as a regulators to have the opportunity to discuss together when the development is at an initial stage, what could be required in terms of data to be collected to have eventually a product agreed for children. So I think this is a result of a global effort from the regulatory side, from the side of the investigator, from the side of Accelerate, but I would say also from the side of the company that probably understand also that this is really important, that is a valuable way to communicate with us.
Thanks. And do you think that that's something which would also be, you know, of value across to other therapeutic areas? You know, not saying that, yes, that it's a blueprint, you know, from oncology to any other field, but very generally as a sort of conceptual path.
For sure, I think, okay, oncology maybe is an area a bit more advanced in this regard, but there have been also in the past workshop for other therapeutic areas where EMA and FDA have worked together. So I think maybe oncology is like a starting point, and we have seen that also Gilles has presented initiative regarding other therapeutic areas similar to the one of the Pediatric Strategy Forum for Oncology. So for sure, it's just there could be also other ways. Like I said, workshops can be useful. Maybe you do not need for every therapeutic area pediatric strategy forums, but for sure you need a platform where companies and regulators and clinicians discuss the development. And this doesn't mean only for oncology, but for all therapeutic areas.
Great, thanks, Franca. And I'm sure we're going to come back to the strategy forums very soon. I want to turn next. Just looking that there are no sort of questions in the chat yet, but you know, turning to you, Greg. So we heard about the cluster. We heard from Thierry about the parallel scientific advice as a tool to engage different regulators in support of global development efforts. With your experience and sort of having also been a sort of driving force within the FDA before you left and sort of strengthening the cluster, looking at the cluster and the parallel scientific advice as two sort of different regulatory mechanisms in that regard, what do you think are the benefits of each, and at what stage of development discussions would you recommend each being used best so that it really facilitates and accelerates global pediatric development? And then a sort of a last second part to the question, if I may, you know, having now moved away from FDA to the NCI, what would be, you know, top of your wish list to be done, you know, next to further improve regulatory global cooperation? These two questions.
Only two questions rolled into one. Thank you, Dominic. But to answer your first one, you know, I think the strength of the cluster or the strength of the cluster calls. And when comparing it to the parallel scientific advice means of reaching some form or some degree of regulatory alignment between EMA and FDA, is the fact that the cluster calls are much easier to arrange, and the discussions and the advice that we can provide to sponsors is much more timely. And for us, at least in the US, you know, prior to the passage of the Race for Children Act, there was no requirement for a pediatric investigation of a targeted cancer drug, because the requirements were based purely on clinical indication and not on molecular mechanism of action or the molecular target to which a drug was directed. And the whole idea was really to accelerate and facilitate early pediatric investigation, not to have to wait 6 years, 8 years, 10 years, in some cases up to 20 years after a drug was first studied in adults before there was a pediatric evaluation. Because all we had at our disposal from a law perspective was the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, and we could evaluate drugs through the request mechanism, which was purely voluntary. And as you can imagine, most sponsors didn't wish to actually, when we submitted written requests, they were not always accepted. So I think the fact that the common commentaries that result from the cluster calls can be provided in a much more rapid timeline. And we have only 90 days to evaluate an initial pediatric study plan that is submitted by a sponsor. And clearly, the time involved in setting up and actually coming to an agreement and having something that goes back to a sponsor in the form of a report from the parallel scientific advice process takes much, much longer than 90 days. And again, we're interested early on in a limited type of study. We're talking about studies that are evaluating PK, dosing, tolerability, and maybe looking at signals of activity. So we're not talking about full development plans. And in that case, in the case where we are talking about large, formal, full development plans, and if there are specific processes or policies that need to be changed or discussed, then I think that is the time for the parallel scientific advice. But I think for early decisions about what's required in the legislation, a molecular cancer investigation, to do it as rapidly as possible, that is the benefit of the common commentary. I think one thing that we hear from industry is that they are not part of those discussions. They're not part of the process. They're not participating actively in the meetings. It's just the regulatory agencies. But I think the purpose of our coming together is as regulatory agencies to provide some sort of common direction at a very high scientific level. I think when there are more intricate details of development, when there are concerns about manufacturing, when there are concerns about formulation, when there are really major discussions regarding endpoints and qualification of endpoints, validation of assessment techniques, then the parallel scientific advice, I think, would be an appropriate forum for those discussions.
Great, thanks, Greg. That's helpful. And again, I think being conscious about the fact that there's a difference between sort of oncology drug development here in that regard and sort of other therapeutic areas, obviously, but I think that's a very sort of helpful context you provided here. I've seen there's a question in the chat, and we'll come to that soon. But I wanted to sort of take your point up, Greg. On the fact that we're hearing very often from industry colleagues, there's a desire to sort of get around the table with EMA and FDA or with different regulators in general to discuss developments. And I think we have explored other avenues in that regard under the confidentiality agreements in place, and as you know well, EMA is observing for example Type F meetings at the FDA, and maybe I'm just putting it out there and maybe asking Donna and Franca, but with that sort of in mind, do you think there are other opportunities where we could think about EMA and or FDA participating, observing discussions with industry as part of existing procedures and processes of the respective regulatory counterpart, to just trying to sort of explore are there additional opportunities we might see to sort of further facilitating exchange and discussions beyond the cluster, which I hear and believe has a very sort of unique purpose in that regard. I don't know, Donna, do you want to start? And apologies for putting you on the spot. Then maybe Franca.
No. So I think I would say that there have been opportunities to engage with industry with some of the workshops and other activities that have occurred outside the cluster. For example, the one that I placed on the slide about the PAH discussions. There's also the Great Work, which is I think in its 7th incarnation now, started out from a cluster discussion in the GI area. So I think that's where the discussions can go, to these public forums to discuss the topics. But I think keeping the initial discussion between the two agencies makes us both feel very comfortable, all of us feel very comfortable in discussing those issues where there might be, some different areas of approach for where we might be able to come together to one path forward. And we do, communicate with the sponsors through the common commentary when it's appropriate. And then the sponsor can go back to the review division or go back to EMA and ask questions about that. But I think the important thing from my perspective is that we've laid it out on the table, that we've discussed it, that we're on the same page in terms of where we're going with things. And then the sponsor knows that, that we're working within that, framework.
Yeah, no, very helpful. And thanks, Donna. Franca, do you want to add anything before maybe moving on then?
Yes, maybe, other conditions where we could have FDA, for example, from our side, attending the discussion are in case we have a clarification TC for products that were, for pediatric development that were submitted at the same time, clearly previous the agreement from the applicant to have FDA participating. We have some cases in the past where FDA attended the discussion during the oral explanation, and I think these are really ways where it's important for both agencies to really discuss at the same time, even if not discussing, at least to take part to the discussion that we have with the sponsors is in a way helpful, and a way to further exchanging information in addition clearly to the workshops that maybe to a bit related to more general topics compared to discussion on a specific product. So I think this is another area that we can explore even more in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Franca. That's very clear. Coming also to the first sort of question in the Q&A relating to clinical research the role of clinical research networks in global collaboration. Jill, can I pull you in and ask you? So I mean, one thing is, having pioneered the strategy forums, really being a mechanism now to support global developments in pediatric oncology. You've introduced it also now through C4C to other therapeutic areas. And you mentioned that in your presentations. So with your experience, first, why do you think multi-stakeholder meetings are key to supporting global development efforts and are here to stay, if you wish? And then that regard, maybe you also would like to comment on how Accelerate is funded, because that was a previous question in the Q&A. And second, then, what is, in your opinion, the biggest challenge in replicating multi-stakeholder meetings outside of oncology? And maybe you also have an idea how to sort of overcome these challenges. And maybe we can then come back to the question of the clinical research networks and global collaboration.
Thank you, Dominic. Would you like me to answer in 60 seconds or a little more?
You have only 60 seconds, I'm afraid.
Okay, great. First, I would like to place the Accelerate Strategy Forum and the concept in just the discussion we had, and you beautifully describe how FDA, EMA are really working together with individual sponsor on individual asset and proposal. And I think the value of what we are proposing is having this multi-stakeholder discussion with several industry in a given framework, for example, the pathway, understanding the respective value of the compound in the understanding of the biology and the needs of the patient. And I think it's really helpful for then the discussion between the FDA, EMA, and the sponsor, understanding the landscape. For example, in the recent strategy forum at EMA, where we're discussing DNA repair agents, we are discussing PARP inhibition, ATR inhibition, ATM inhibition, CHEK1 inhibition, with the sponsor having drugs in this class. So I think it provides additional information for the discussion in between the regulatory bodies and sponsor, especially when there is a need not to do every development plan, not to develop any medicine, but to prioritize some of them. That is the first question. And I think this is the same outside of oncology. And clearly, atopic dermatitis, when we looked at how many drugs are in development in this chronic disease, which is really occurring in children and impacting the daily life of children and adolescents, There's a very exciting drug development program in several new pathways, but that not all of these medicine can be developed in children. So clearly helping understanding how it is, how it could be prioritized, and really address the right drug for the patient is really the concept of a multi-stakeholder meeting, either in oncology or outside of oncology. Did they answer part of your question?
Well, the second part of the question, excuse me, the second part of the question we will return to tomorrow because I am respectful of time. The second part of the question is how do the clinical trial networks and network of networks contribute to this sort of global consideration? So let me just say I'm Barbara Beer. I'm the faculty director of the MRCT Center, and I'm interrupting because I believe we need to close this out. This is part 1 of 2. Tomorrow we're going to pick up where we left off. This was a terrific down payment on different models, none of which are really mutually exclusive. And one of the things we're going to
Excuse me,
work
Barbara.
Yeah.
We actually have until 11:30 today, so we have another.
Oh, we do?
minutes.
Oh, whoops.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I take it all back. I won't close out now. That's my mistake. It's a great discussion. I'll shut up. Go ahead.
Thank you, Barbara. Just 6 seconds.
You have 30 more
International
seconds.
collaboration. And then you can move to, because there are other panelists really
Yes.
probably willing to contribute. In Accelerate, we had an international collaboration working group, understanding the issue, decrease in the number of academic trials, where clearly the number of industry trials globally is developing. And clearly understanding the issue is extremely important. I can tell you we have an ongoing program with the COG, with the NCI, with the ITCC, trying to understand how we can develop transatlantic academic trial. And you cannot figure out the complexity of it. And we need to solve this complexity to be able to run this academic global trial that really addresses the needs, especially in the very rare disease. Stop.
Thanks, Jill. So what I'm taking is that really, you know, the goal of international collaboration between networks is to sort of maybe, you know, focus on overcoming sort of, you know, identifying and overcoming operational challenges, you know, and that's certainly something which I think is very often far too, you know, underestimated and neglected, I think, when we speak about global collaboration in general. I'm very conscious that we have Ellie with us as well as a panelist, and I would like to bring you to the table, Ellie, from an industry perspective. You've participated to several strategy multi-stakeholder forums. I would like to sort of understand, you know, from an industry perspective, what's the value in participating? Has it sort of changed your decision making? And then, you know, I'll become famous for 2-part questions, sort of squeezing 2 in 1. I think I would relate it to the cluster. I would equally value sort of your view here in terms of, you know, if so, did it help you achieving agreement on global development plans? What's your experience here? Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic, for the 2-part question. With respect to the pediatric strategy forums through Accelerate, as Jill described, I think the benefit for everybody, not just industry, is really a deeper understanding of the landscape, both in terms of the unmet needs, an understanding of what's currently in development and where things stand, and then also listening to the patient advocates and caregivers and their perspectives of what's needed and absolutely necessary. And I've seen those conversations now, having participated in several of those forums, you know, having that open dialogue and hearing from all parties, and having a general set of, you know, recommendations or general understanding of the landscape, then taking those conversations through, you know, that are published, and then using that as a platform for further engagement and one-on-one conversations and negotiations with the PDCO or FDA respectively. And I've definitely seen sort of doors open to those types of dialogues as a result of the conversations that are had at those forums. So I think not just myself, but other my colleagues in industry, I found them very helpful in terms of really getting clarity in our pediatric study proposals. And then your second question in terms of the cluster, I have seen in my prior company, we did not request it proactively, but received a common commentary that highlighted sort of the mutual issues identified by both agencies that we then, respectively addressed. It did give us sort of a heads up, right, of what the major issues were that we had to address. So it was helpful. To Greg's point, and sort of the common issue that industry has is, we're not able to really have an active dialogue in terms of exploring in the context of a common commentary, whether there's other paths, right? So you just get the advice and then you have to then follow through with each agency independently. So it's helpful, but it would be helpful in addition to have a forum, ideally with both agencies, right, to have some exchange, especially when you get, when you receive input that perhaps wasn't expected, right? And they're, the only course is really to then take that advice and diverge, respectively with FDA and then EMA to sort those issues out.
Right. Yeah. No, that's understood. I wanted to sort of I'm not very conscious of time all the time. You just tell me when we have to stop. I wanted to sort of seeing the last question in the Q&A around reliance and there are other aspects than clinical strategy, such as formulation and non-clinical toxicology, that would be something for reliance, and that sort of brings me to your presentation, Marie, sort of really giving us great examples of reliance in the pediatric space, and to me, what we've seen also with COVID and is that reliance essentially builds very much on transparency, right? Sharing information, sharing data, sharing assessment reports. So what role do you think transparency can play or should play as a tool, towards better global cooperation within the sort of overarching idea or topic around reliance?
Thanks a lot, Dominic. Yes, indeed, transparency is a key element of a milestone of any of the reliance approach. And I think COVID-19, the response to COVID-19 has shown us that, with the highest level of collaboration and sharing information, great things could be achieved. So in terms of pediatric, I think it's great to see all the work of the pediatric cluster, the commentary, and more an increasing level of collaboration and working together. We see a lot, I think, exciting times, because we see a lot of innovative and new model of reliance with more and more work sharing. So I mentioned the one, for example, for post-authorization. And I think maybe we could see a future in terms of pediatric, or where we could have a type of work sharing. Because on a voluntary basis, I know that the templates are not fully harmonized and everybody works with different legislation, but you could see a future, and I don't know how long this future will take, but in terms of offering a pilot to have a work sharing model between the two agencies, where on a voluntary basis, the industry could submit to the two regulators at the same time, combine the question, having the opportunity to discuss, as some of the industry representatives were saying, to discuss the different question and try to align.
That could be an interesting model for the future. In terms of what we've heard today, I think one of the important aspects is also early alignments. And we've seen it with COVID, and we've seen it with also some of the workshops discussing some of the new development. It's very important for regulators to have early alignments and to have some of the forums and the workshops to discuss that, and also collaboration and focusing efforts. And it's all what we're trying to do. So it's connecting the dots and making sure that we're all working towards the same goals and defining these goals. So in terms of, for example, for the Global Accelerator for Pediatric Formulation, one of the first exercises is prioritization. What are the priorities? And it's easy to do it for each of the diseases, but I realize that it's difficult to do for across diseases. But I think it's as a community, we have to ask ourselves, what are the priorities, and where can we put more effort in that priorities? And how can we work together collaboratively to try to close those gaps?
Yeah, no, thanks, and I'm sure that's a topic which might sort of also come up tomorrow, as one could probably also argue, having different people looking at things independently might also enhance and sort of increase the robustness and the value of the respective outcomes. But I don't want to sort of go into details here, but would like to sort of rather take a sort of a step back and sort of ask you, Tahira, if assuming a PIP would be fully transparency published. We're publishing already our PIP decisions on the EMA webpage, but only a sort of summary of the respective study title. But assuming this would be something where you would see much more detail, in terms of design elements, is that something where you would think this actually would help, us as industry in further, working towards a global development effort? Is that something where you would see value? I think you're muted. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, I definitely do. I mean, I've always found those published feedback very useful, and it's also good to compare how other products have, what kind of feedback they've received. It informs, development for our own products. So I've found that really helpful.
Is that Elisa, something you would echo as well?
Yes, Dominic, sorry. I agree with Tahira.
I just asked whether there's any commercially confidential information there that you'd be concerned about.
I didn't see anything that would raise a flag. I thought it was very discreetly done. I mean, maybe one question I could ask Dr. Riemann is whether there are any plans for doing the same for PSPs.
I would like to say yes, Tahira, because I think there would be benefit in sharing that information, but at the present time, from my understanding, the PSPs are considered confidential information. Although, it's not absolutely clear to me why, because there's very little really proprietary information about the product itself in the PSPs, but they are right now confidential. So I personally thought it was a huge advantage that we were at least able to share it with our colleagues at the EMA and the other regulatory agencies that participate in the cluster and could have discussions about the plans that were outlined. But I'm not aware that there are any immediate plans to make the PSPs public. And it's very similar to the situation with written requests, and the written requests, the details, the contents of the written requests aren't made public until the final study report from the studies that are included in the written request are actually submitted. So it's something that I think is a decision of the Office of Chief Counsel at the FDA, and I don't see anything immediately on the horizon that's going to change.
That is too bad, because clearly that would be extremely helpful. We do have pediatric investigation plan published on the website, not all the key binding element, but useful information. If we would have the same IPSP, I think it would serve everyone, including the regulatory agency. I understand it's complex, but really, this would really make the field completely different. That would be great. Sorry for interrupting, Dominique.
If I may, I've got also on the same topic, just to say, we've mentioned during my presentation, I mentioned the ROM action plan discussion, and we've got our next meeting next week. And one of the items is maybe also for the industry to look at publishing their PSP, because if it's not done by the regulators, maybe there could be some more transparency from the industry, and they can decide which level of details and which level of transparency they want to apply. But I think indeed it would be very, very important and very helpful for the global community. For us, for example, within the GAPF, when we are trying to develop products for global use, we are trying to see what is done in the different, and I think it will help all the pediatric community to have more transparency regarding what has been required, what has been done, and to help moving the agenda forward. So I think we are in discussion, and I don't know in which shape or form this commitment could be agreeable upon, but it's one of the asks from the next ROM action plan meeting that we'll be discussing next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Marie. Greg, and then Tahira, please.
Yeah, I would just echo Marie's comment because I fully agree. But the reason that the IPSPs are kept confidential is because of industry's concerns. So I don't think there's anything necessarily inherent in U.S. regulations or in the law. But if industry were willing to make the contents of the IPSPs and written requests public, then I wouldn't see any problem. And it's only because of their prohibition that they aren't made public and shared. So I think anything that could be done to change that, and that may be a real role for advocates who are truly instrumental in any regulatory or legislative policy change. It's generally only accomplished through our patient and parent advocates.
Very clear. Thanks, Greg. Tahira, please.
Yeah, very quickly, I think one thing that can really help sponsors is if there was just one common template for PIPs and PSPs, because I think that's where a lot of our resources are spent. I mean, if that's under consideration, that would be great. At least it could be offered as an option in case, particularly if you have common commentary or you've gone through parallel scientific advice, and you know that there's a high degree of convergence between the two agencies. I mean, that option would really help facilitate the process for us.
Thanks, Marie.
Yeah, and on that one, I think I fully agree. And I think because in any case, the supportive documentation is the same. So it's a question of the way it is included in the different documents. And also, as we've seen for the moment, we've got 3 countries and 1 region with mandatory requirements. You wouldn't want everybody to have a different, if there is later on some additional country with mandatory requirements, you wouldn't want to have a different, template for all the other different countries. So I think it would very benefit to try to work on a globally accepted template for pediatric plans. That would be really appreciated. Yes. And we are happy to support any of this activity. Thank you.
Thanks, Marie. More food for thought for tomorrow. Tahira.
I actually didn't. I don't know how it happened. I'm sorry.
Okay. That's that's totally fine. There are a couple of sort of comments and questions in the chat relating to transparency, relating to confidential information, which run through all the respective documents. The need to sort of be conscious about the timing of such publications, as there might be, impacts on the adult programs. I think all very valid and relevant considerations. There's another sort of AJ put another comment out around relating to the issue on reliance and the sort of wondering how much is this sort of driven by limiting resources sort of devoted to pediatrics. Marie, do you want to comment on that?
Oops, yes, I know. I think I fully agree. And we know that pediatric, in terms of regulators, are a bit often, and we know that there is limited resources allocated in regulatory authorities for pediatric activities. And also taking on the point of, like having two different review in parallel, etc. What we always say for reliance, it shouldn't be seen as an excuse to reduce resources. It just should be seen as a more efficient model to use the existing resources. So, and also in terms of, so what we hear sometimes from the industry is that, for example, in 2/3 of the cases, the PSP and PIP are aligned. There is 1/3 that sometimes there is some divergency. So it's just in case of trying to work more closely together to try to have a closer alignment. But definitely not. It wouldn't be an excuse to try to reduce even more the resources. It will, I think, like globally, for us, we obviously have a global perspective with 194 member states, and we can see that the global regulatory resources are limited, and so we should make sure that we can make the best use and try to see where we can avoid duplication or where we can have more synergy between the work of regulators. Thank you.
Thanks, Marie. Very clear. And another comment in the Q&A that certainly, with regard to a common template, that there's always the issue in terms of what do the respective agencies actually want to see in the respective submission package. That's certainly well taken. It's 5:23. I have to say I really enjoyed the discussion. I think there are a lot of sort of points which panelists tomorrow will surely pick up on, and I'm very much looking forward to that part of the webinar. I would like to thank you all for your participation, and looking forward to tomorrow, and handing over to Lisa, Barbara. I don't know who sort of would like to take it.
I'm going to close it out yet again. With apologies for having interrupted before. So tomorrow we're going to continue this incredibly rich discussion and pick up on where we're leaving off now. I think there are, today we started with these, 4 models to give a sense of the different optionality that exists. Not to say that any are problematic or better than the others. They each have their own place, and we don't want to undermine the value proposition of any of them. One of the questions we're going to pick up on tomorrow is how can we expand the reach of these, and how much is resource limitations to the agencies on the one hand, and to sponsor time and other commitments that are overriding and competitive with these kinds of cooperative models, sort of limiting their scale in a sense. And what could we do about that? This issue of the common PIP or PSP template we'll pick up on. the role of pediatric clinical trial networks, I think, is important to sort of come back to. Gilles, when you spoke about the value of the tribe, of the accelerate sort of having all the stakeholders in the room, it made me think of how foundational that would be for developing platform trials in these kinds of, as a future goal for increasing the efficiency and utility of trials, knowing that many of these populations are very, very limited. Where prioritization of these different products is a challenge. Lots to come back to, and I only encourage everyone to continue to think about both how this knits together in a global framework. You know, yes, we focused largely on EMA, FDA, and other major health regulatory authorities, Health Canada, Swissmedic, and PMDA. But as Marie so gently reminded us, there are 194 countries that are in the WHO family, and their reliance, either as reliance or cooperative review or other kinds of models, has a real role. So tomorrow we will come back to sort of further moving through some of these questions and ask each of you to think through, both as audience and as panelists, what can we do to really move this agenda in a positive direction? You know, besides explaining these different models or approaches and finding their appropriate place, what else can be done to deepen that understanding and advance a future where there's greater cooperation, less duplication, and more communication? I think we had an early twinkle of some of those ideas today, and I look forward to coming back to those tomorrow. And only want to really thank everyone for engaging today and being so forthright, so clear, and such excellent presentations, and then a wonderful discussion. The slides and recording will be available on Thursday, I believe. And we look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow for an even richer discussion. Many thanks. Have a wonderful day, evening, morning, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.